Hey everyone, I'm Nate Lambert with Red River, and today we're going to take a look at some password best practices and tips to make sure you're as secure as possible when using your Windows 10 workstation. Today we're going to talk, as I discussed, a little bit about Windows 10 and how to make sure that all your passwords are in line with industry best practices. First, I want to start by just clarifying passwords, passphrases, passcodes. There's a lot of terminology in the industry about what they are. They're all essentially the same, right? So it's something that you know, that ideally no one else knows, that you use to authenticate into a system. So you probably have thousands of passwords at this point, for your banking, for your work laptop, personal laptop, cell phones, things of that nature. And ideally, all of those are following kind of a set of guidelines or an industry standard that allow you to kind of make sure they're secure and that no one's able to gain access to them. So today we're just going to talk through kind of a brief list of some of the things you really should be considering when you're creating a new password for yourself, either for a personal device or for a corporate device. Most of the ones we're going to talk about today are more applicable directly to using a Windows 10 workstation. However, these are really going to apply to any device in your life, as we talked about, whether it's a Macintosh machine, an Apple iPhone, an Android cell phone, anything of that nature. So first things to start off with that is you'd like to use different passwords on all your different accounts. So as we just discussed, most people nowadays have dozens of devices. And while it may be challenging to remember different passwords for all those different things, ideally, you want to make sure that you have some differentiation between all of them. So step one would be to use different passwords for different accounts. And the reason this is so critical, it can seem a little bit obvious, but is that if one of your passwords becomes compromised, either because you inadvertently share it with another user or it's maliciously obtained by some sort of security threat, ideally you limit the impact of that vulnerability by only having that password work on one account. So you have multiple bank accounts or multiple different work IDs. Using a different password can really help you to make sure that if one becomes compromised, you don't have to then change hundreds of other passwords. So that's really key. Very simple, but it's a really good habit to get into. And we'll talk a little bit later on about how you can maybe help if you have too many passwords to manage, because obviously I understand the thought can be to just have one password for everything, makes it easier to remember, but we'll talk a little bit about how you can get around that. The second key is length always trumps complexity. So what's interesting about this is most people's initial thought is to try to make their password as complex as possible, either a sequence of characters that are really unique, not a dictionary word, but maybe just a bunch of special characters in a row, but they'll still only make their password 7 or 8 characters long. So what's actually kind of maybe a little counterintuitive for most people is that a longer password is actually more secure. So what that means is you'd rather have more concise 16-character passwords than really complex 8-character passwords. That has to do with the mechanisms with which people go about trying to actually find out passwords from people, but using things like dictionaries and code sequences to understand what passwords are. Malicious entities would have a lot harder time with 16 characters because every additional value exponentially increases the number of chances and options that there are. So the probability of it being cracked actually goes exponentially down. So if you're coming up with a password, 16 or more characters is really ideal. So that's what you want to shoot for here. All right. And next, the one thing we really want to go over is make passwords that are hard to guess but easy to remember. Hard to guess, but easy to remember. Another one that sounds really kind of obvious to people, but what that means is that if you come up with a sequence of dictionary words, however, we try not to use words that are in the dictionary, but if you need to, try to come up with a sequence that is really obvious to you, but would take a lot of time for someone to come up with, which means they're not typically correlated in any way. They're not like terms. So like all the names of your children or your pets, that might be tough because those are probably details that are publicly available on Facebook or on your social media. So if you use them all in one order, your password could be 25 characters long, but they're relatively easy and in order. If you come up with something really kind of difficult to understand, like apple, dog, cat, that would be pretty easy. But then if you were to come up with something like the street you lived on, Wood Hill, and then maybe the zip code from the town you were born in, right? And things that are more challenging to find. If you can string those all together and put them into some sort of complex long key, it's actually going to be more secure. So single words, dictionary terms, try to avoid singles like that. But if you can compound them together, every time you do that, it makes it a little more challenging to guess, but still easier for you to remember. 16 or 20 character string of letters is going to be almost impossible for you to remember, and you're going to write them down. So that's not what you want either. The next step would be to make sure that complexity does count, just less than length, right? And what I mean by that is we want our passwords to be nice and long, and we don't want them to be so complex that you have to write them down. But it is good to remember that having them a little complex will help make them more secure. So not using information that is too personal and too easily readily available, as we discussed, children's names, pets' names, those are pretty hard. The car you drive, things that people might know about you. But because we did emphasize that you want to have something that you're not going to write down, making sure that your password has a little complexity is really key. And the way to do that would be to use uppercase, lowercase, and special character combinations. So what can happen is you can use a peculiar sequence of uppercase characters versus lowercase. You can also then add in special characters in replace of letters. A really popular one would be to use like a 0 instead of an O, or a 3 instead of an E, right? This is kind of a common. So here we'll just do an example. So for password, that's obviously relatively simple. So this would be a bad example. For password, if you were going to do this one, you could then substitute some different letters and some different capitalization that would then make the password more secure. So that's kind of an example of a stronger password. Now, the reason I bring that up is because then that allows you to touch on all of our rules, right? So we could use a different password for different accounts. We could then make it a little more lengthy, for example. So if we wanted to make it a strong password, it's now getting closer to that 16 character target. But it's also going to be fairly hard for someone to guess, right? Even if I thought your password was strong password, it would then take me a long time to discern which special characters you used, which capitalization you used, where the special characters lie in the sequence. And then it also increases that sort of factor of me being able to remember it, right? I know my password is strong password, but now if I can remember those special characters, I'm in pretty good shape for trying to remember that and making it something that no one else can guess, which is always what we're looking for. Number 5, never reveal your passwords to anyone. This is actually a really, really key thing to drive home, especially in a world where we're working more remote. We have more involvement with our IT staff than maybe we used to. In most environments, no one should ever be asking for your passwords, right? And that extends to both personal and professional. So Apple is never going to call and ask you for a passcode to your Apple system. They use tools like multi-factor authentication and sequencing, which we'll touch in later videos. Those are ways that they'll recoup that information from you. So really, you should never need to share your passwords with anyone. That's not something that somebody should be asking for. Your IT staff really should never ask. So just get in the habit of not sharing them. Obviously, you may have to share them with a significant other or a family member if that's absolutely necessary. But by and large, a good general rule, just keep them to yourselves. You'll be most secure. And that's really kind of where you should be. So in conclusion, just to kind of recap our 5 quick tips here, using different passwords for different accounts. Length always trumps complexity. Shoot for those longer passwords. 16 characters is really ideal. Make them hard to guess, but easy to remember. Complexity does still count, so try to work in some of those special characters like the examples we have here. And then really last but certainly not least, just keep those passwords to yourself. In another video, we will talk about password containers, some applications that can make it easier for you to remember all these passwords you have. But we'll touch upon that in a later video. So that's all we have time for today. We hope you learned something. Be sure to check back our YouTube channel for more security tips and tricks, and be sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe on our Red River YouTube channel. Thanks.